Greetings and salutations. Welcome back to Colin's Last Stand right here on YouTube. My name is Colin Moriarty. As always, I hope everything's going well in your lives and that you and yours are having a very productive and happy week. Today's episode is actually part 2 of a 2-part episode that began during episode 44. This is episode 45, and I highly recommend that if you have not seen that episode yet, that you would watch that episode first. It's basically a 2-part episode about the hypothetical, as the title of the video represents already, the hypothetical presidency of Colin Moriarty. And this was a topic that was given to me by a Patreon vote over at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand. So as you remember, and as you probably already know, this show is ad-free and independent. The only source of revenue right now is over at patreon.com/ColinsLastStand. So please consider going over there and giving $1 or $2 or $5 or $10 a month or whatever you can to let this independent venture kind of thrive and exist. And I appreciate all of you out there that do that for me. It really does mean a lot. So the first video was all about the how and the why. How I would run, why I would run, all of that. It's an interesting video, but I think this video is going to be even better because this is about specifically what I want to do as president. It's not going to be this overarching kind of all-encompassing sort of thing. I'm not going to be able to talk to you about all of the legislative initiatives and all of the problems I want to tackle, but I've really gone ahead and split it into 3 parts. And we'll go into those 3 parts in sequence. I want to talk to you about spending and taxes. I want to talk to you about the role of the military and our role in the world. And then I want to talk about domestic policy and how I think the government's too much in your lives. So let's tick those off one by one, starting with taxes and spending. Here we go. The biggest, broadest, and most important set of goals for the Moriarty administration will revolve around getting the United States fiscal house in order. The United States is $20 trillion in debt. $20 trillion. It's an unfathomable amount of money, fully a third of which is owed to other countries. The U.S. debt is so gigantic that to pay it back, every American, all 325 million of us, would need to cough up around $60,000 each. That's right, let that sink in. The U.S. is drowning in debt to such a degree that money owed on an individual basis is literally twice the median annual income. The amount owed is 5 times more than the government spends per year and roughly 6 times more than it effectively taxes per annum. Indeed, the amount owed is equivalent to the value of the entire American economy. It's perfectly normal for a country to have debt. Alexander Hamilton, the first U.S. Treasury Secretary, made it a priority for the federal apparatus to assume Revolutionary-era debts of the individual states in order to make the American government a player on the global financial stage. But anyone who tells you that it's normal for a country to owe its creditors $60,000 per citizen is lying to you. The United States debt is a ticking time bomb, and when it finally explodes, we're all going to wish we had gotten a handle on it, mitigating the inevitable catastrophe that awaits. There are multiple ways to fix the problem. The Moriarty administration will pursue all of them in unison, but the biggest thing we need to grapple with is government spending. Any reasonable person will agree that the government spends too much. It's too big, it does too little for its size, and it cannot justify its cost. There's a place for government, there's a place for involved government, but there isn't a place for this heinous level of bureaucracy around every corner and in every nook and cranny. This isn't a Republican or conservative idea. A significant majority of Americans think the government is too large and too powerful. Only a third of America's population thinks the government is the right size. Ignore the fringe elements. This is a winning message with Americans. It's just that no one has the balls to really try and tackle it. Since the American government and its many tendrils cannot bring itself down to size, a bill will be put before Congress that immediately freezes government spending in place while a comprehensive audit of every single cent the government spends is undertaken. This will lead to recommendations on cuts. Some of the cuts will be severe. Some programs, groups, and even a few cabinet-level organizations are going to need to go. In other ways, we can spend more, and we can invest wisely in what we need to invest in. But we can't keep spending like we're spending, and when I'm in charge, we won't. My goal is to cut government spending by 1/5. That's 20%. Once discretionary spending is taken care of, we will aim our sights on entitlement spending. Medicare and Social Security will need to be means tested, and the ages to receive both will need to be placed on an automatically increasing cycle that raises the age of eligibility 1 year for every 5 years that pass. Otherwise, the math doesn't work. Politicians have lied about this and dodged this for too long. No more. While the spending freeze is in play, I'm going to make one of the biggest moves of my tenure and likely the heaviest political lift of all. I'm going to rally for a constitutional amendment that forces the government to spend what it takes in, and not a penny more. In my proposed balanced budget amendment, the government can borrow up to $5,000 per citizen to make ends meet. So at our current population of 325 million, the total debt number couldn't surpass $3.25 trillion. Once that number is exceeded, it cannot borrow until the debt is paid down below that threshold, an entire system that will only be triggered once our existing debt is paid down, which will take many years. There will be exceptions baked into the amendment that give the government two primary ways out of these rules. If the US is in a declared war, or if the US is experiencing certain economic parameters, such as a certain unemployment rate or level of inflation, the rules can be discarded. Otherwise, the government has to spend what it takes in. This too isn't a controversial idea. Nearly every state in the US has balanced budget provisions that keep state houses from drowning in their own debt. The US government can and will get in on the act. The final component of the fiscal assault on planning is taxes. The American tax system is ridiculous, but it's here that my promise of moderation and compromise will play out for all to see. My hard and fast position is that taxes need to go down across the board, period. How we do that is up in the air. If it were up to me, I'd eliminate the income tax completely and replace it with a broad value-added tax, or VAT, on non-essentials. That's not a pragmatic or practical solution, though. Instead, I think flattening the tax will do, but not completely. When we talk about a flat tax, we talk about everyone paying the same percentage in taxes without deductions, no matter what you make. That sounds awesome, but again, that's a steep hill to climb. I'd instead work to flatten the tax into 4 progressively higher brackets. If you make at or below the poverty level for an individual, your tax rate will be 0%, and you'll simply need to file with the government to verify that. If you make up to $100,000, your tax rate will be 10%. From there to $10 million, your tax rate will be 20%. All money made after the 10 million threshold will be taxed at 30%. Granular deductions will only be allowed for those making up to $500,000, and then you're cut off. The legislation will indicate that with situational exceptions, these rates represent the ceiling, and the more the debt is paid down, the lower the rates will go, starting with the lower tax brackets first, since most revenue is gained from the top 20% of Americans, and in reality, the top 1% pay everyone else's bills. Let them continue to pay their fair share, while alleviating tax stress for the poor, working, and middle classes, not to mention small business owners. Between changes to the tax structure, a significant cut in spending, and prioritizing lowering the debt, we can get there. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. So the first salvo is fired. We take taxes on, we take spending on, we solve those problems. But now the next step is the military and our place in the world. In short, the military is way too big, and I think the rest of the world relies way too much on the United States. In my administration, both of those things would change mightily. The American military isn't only too big, it's also way too expensive. Just a few days ago, Congress passed, with overwhelming bipartisan support, mind you, $700 billion in military spending for 1 year. America accounts for about 40% of global military spending, with only 4.5% of the global population, and it's a monumental waste of money, and a great way to continue to squander our ability to do good things when necessary, instead of perpetuating a war machine that serves no practical purpose today in 2017. China, the country with the second most military spending, has literally 1 billion more people within its borders than we do. Its military spending in 2016 was a still staggering $215 billion. That means that the country in second place in military spending has 4 times our population and spends a third of what we do on its military. In fact, at $700 billion per year, the US now spends more on its military than China, Russia, India, France, the UK, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Italy, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Israel combined. And to what end exactly? The United States isn't the world's police force. During the world wars, and certainly thereafter, during the Cold War, our military, and even more importantly, our manufacturing capabilities, were looked at as an essential defense against tyranny and aggression. The world is different today. Under my leadership, military spending would be cut in half over 5 years, reaching that goal in 5 separate 10% cuts until military spending is no more than $350 billion per year. If you were confused as to how we could pay for what we need to pay for with the tax cuts I proposed earlier in this video, since the spending cuts don't match up, this is where a significant portion of our savings comes from. We have every prerogative to maintain bases in countries around the world, but we don't need to have 800 of them. We literally have 800 military bases around the world outside of America's borders, and it's ridiculous. More than half a percentage point of the American population is actively or passively serving in the military. We don't need 1.3 million active military men and women. I'd cut that number in half. We'd bolster our reserve forces to 2 million from around 800,000 in the process. We'd be ready for anything and everything. But readiness doesn't mean waiting, because that seems to be what our military doctrine is today. Waiting for something to go wrong so we can justify this major expenditure. We have more tanks, planes, ships, guns, and just about every other conceivable weapon of war than any other country on Earth. All of it comes at a cost. And what of the men and women put in harm's way, often for completely dubious reasons? I say enough already. It's time to stop. Our doctrine under the Moriarty administration will be this: non-intervention unless absolutely necessary, with a desire to create bilateral and multilateral relationships with countries all over the world, bolstering alliances that could help mitigate the cost on our coffers and our people. NATO, as an example, is an essential alliance. Could we grow it? And could we make other similar alliances elsewhere in the world, particularly in the Pacific, the Indian Ocean, and in the Middle East, all complete with Article 5-like additions that signify an attack against one is an attack against all? The US military is the greatest, bravest, best trained, and best equipped fighting force in the history of humankind. America's ability to mobilize personnel, manufacture equipment, and insert itself into any place on the globe is unparalleled in human history. Nations and groups around the world know full well what we are capable of doing. We should be quieter and more subtle about it, though. Just ask Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany how well it worked out for them when they poked a dormant beast. If an attack happens against the US or a dear ally, we will activate and we will retaliate. Those reserve troops will become active, our manufacturing base will spring to life, and we will do what is necessary. I know all of that will be popular with liberals and isolationist conservatives, but there's also a political piece to the puzzle here. We as a country need to have a long, hard talk about our place in the United Nations and whether it's necessary to be part of the organization at all. I know it sounds insane, but think carefully for a moment. What does the UN do for the world that the US and various alliances couldn't do on its own? The organization is an embarrassment, one primarily funded using American money, and one that often stands in the way of actual justice, of actual community, of actual problem solving. Saudi Arabia, one of the world's most embarrassingly backward societies, sits on the Human Rights Council. It's a farce. I'd propose that Congress conduct a deep and thorough study on what could replace America's part in the UN, primarily with a reinforced diplomatic corps that tends to our interests with other countries in a more direct, vigorous, and brass tacks fashion. In short, with my stance on the military and our role in the world, America should save its money, save the blood of its sons and daughters, look more inward for salvation, and present to the world a posture of peace, friendship, and independence. We are happy to do business with any reasonable nation. We are happy to have military, economic, and social ties to any reasonable nation. But we're not a war machine. We're a constitutional republic. And we're not the world's piggy bank. We have to be more judicious in the manner in which we spend, both for ourselves and for everyone else. I'm curious what you guys are going to think about that particularly because, the military is a popular thing. I love the military. My dad was in the Air Force. I have a cousin in the Army. I have a lot of kind of military connections in my own life, both in college, both with friends and all of the rest. But the military is too big. It's too expensive. It's too bloated. That's not the man who serves problem. That's the Pentagon's problem. That's the federal government's problem. That's Congress's problem. And the Moriarty administration, led by yours truly, is going to do something about it. But there's a final component I want to touch on in this video, and that's how the federal government deals with you. Yes, you. The Moriarty administration will see to it that the government stays out of your lives as much as humanly possible. The government injects itself into our everyday lives in the personal decisions and the choices of families, friends, and lovers, not to mention businesses and other interests, far too often. It is not the federal government's business who you marry, so long as both people are consenting adults. It's not the federal government's business what you put in your body, whether it's the healthiest food possible or junk food laden with sugar. It's not the federal government's business what your sexual orientation or gender identity is. Hell, the federal government has virtually no place in your day-to-day life whatsoever, and I will see to it that my administration, with the weight of Congress, expands upon that when and where necessary. Personal responsibility, the agency to make your own choices, and the right to follow your own hopes and dreams will be made paramount, period. Anything unreasonable that stands in your way of exercising those fundamental rights as an American will be hurdles that are promptly removed, either by legislation or via executive order. A good place to start is with my Justice Department. My Justice Department will be immediately ordered to halt any proceedings against non-violent drug offenders and against states who, in exercising their 10th Amendment rights, have pursued legalized or medical marijuana. The administration will endeavor to study the legalization of marijuana at the federal level, which will then be handed off to Congress so that legislation could be decided upon. But I take it further. Doing illicit drugs is bad for you, and the government shouldn't encourage it, but no one should be in prison for doing drugs if we're having small quantities of drugs on their person. The Justice Department will dispatch to the 50 states recommendations to assess their statewide prison populations for non-violent drug offenders, with a suggestion that they be released immediately upon review. America's prisons are clogged with people that do not belong behind bars. It doesn't only destroy lives, it costs a lot of money. Per capita, the United States is by far the most prisoner-heavy population in the world, and it spends the most on prisons too. That doesn't sync up or at all jive with the freedoms we should all enjoy. If you sell heroin to people, you're going to go away. But if you do heroin, you're not a criminal, though you'll become one if you, say, rob a house in order to pay for your addiction. In short, prisons should be places reserved for the worst of the worst. Violent offenders and serious white-collar criminals, those who assault, rape, and murder, those who rob, steal, and defraud. If you sold a couple of ounces of marijuana, I have no idea why you'd be in prison. And I certainly have no idea why you'd be in prison because you have a drug addiction. It's time to change the way we look at prisons in the US, not to mention the for-profit nature of many of our prisons that seem to be keeping this vicious cycle moving. Societally, we should also endeavor to better understand what the roles are of the individual states. States' rights should be emphasized as the founders had intended. What works in Mississippi won't necessarily work for North Dakota. Positive solutions for California might not at all be positive for Rhode Island. As president, I would encourage as much experimentation as possible at the state and even local levels when it comes to issues ranging from education to scientific research. Not to use the trite old saying, but in the US, we're blessed to have 50 laboratories in which to conduct countless experiments. We can learn a great deal by emphasizing a bottom-up approach, as opposed to a federally mandated top-down approach. I dispatch administration officials to be permanently embedded in each state capital to study what's going on in each state, and what Congress and the executive branch can learn from solutions coming out of cities ranging from Albany and Boise to Little Rock and Madison. By paying closer attention to the legislative and executive bodies that deal closely with state populations, the federal government could ascertain an incredible amount of positive data about how to best proceed when local and state governments encounter insurmountable problems, or figure out new solutions that might be spread to the entire republic. Local and state governments are places where the real hard work of governance is undertaken. My administration won't only applaud that reality, it'll make sure all is done to put the power back into the hands of these governments, which best serve the unique people and unique situations in each state. Finally, I will make the American government a force for good when it comes to science, technology, and all manner of learning. Global warming is real, it's at least partially man-made, and it's wreaking havoc on our planet. How can we best proceed to help combat this planetary issue? More money will be infused into the likes of NASA, the Endowment for the Arts and Humanities, our system of museums starting with the Smithsonian Network, and much more, in order to encourage a cycle of learning, and to foster in our society a real love of advancement, education, and understanding. When it comes to what the government currently spends, these programs cost next to nothing. It costs next to nothing to keep our national parks clean. It costs next to nothing to research new medicines, to send satellites into space, to investigate and satisfy all matter of academic inquiry. Better yet, making America a leader in these regards will have the undeniably positive effect of making our next generations excited about these essential fields and how they may participate in finding the answers we seek in the future. There are many things that we as a people cannot and should not do together, but there's a lot that we can and should do together as a nation. The Moriarty administration will be committed to cutting through the clutter, differentiating one from another, and earnestly pursuing that which enriches our society and adds great weight to our traditions and the things we hold most near and dear to ourselves at home. Well, I'm going to be really interested to see what you guys think of this video, so of course, let me know in the comments below. I'm always down there with you interacting, and give me that feedback. Let me know what I got right. Let me know what I got wrong. Let me know what I should prioritize and shouldn't prioritize. We're going to have a good conversation, I feel like, over this video. Also, please consider sharing this video with your friends and family and letting them know about the majesty and the wonder of Colin's Last Stand. I won't waste any more of your time today. I hope you have a great rest of your day. I hope you and yours are very well, and I will see you next time for more Colin's Last Stand. Keep on learning.